Well, I mean, I think the phenomenon of this mass incarceration has been kind of in this created world of crime, which tends to be directed at the poor and the vulnerable. So our prison population was stable for all of these decades throughout the 20th century, from 1900 to 1972, around 200,000, around 300,000. And then we go from 300,000 in 1972 to 2.3 million today. And we achieve that with basically three strategies. We criminalize drug dependency, treat it as a crime rather than as a health issue, which is what a lot of other countries have done. We impose these mandatory sentences on people so that you get really long prison sentences for very minor crimes. I've represented people who've written bad checks, who've stolen a pizza, who've committed very petty crimes that end up with life in prison. And then we've had an enforcement strategy that is very aggressive, that targets people who are suspect, who are presumed dangerous and guilty. And each one of these strategies, if you will, have disproportionately impacted people of color. Because if you're affluent, if you have resources, you can use drugs recreationally in a much more secure way than you can when you live in the public housing projects, when you live on the streets. And the police are very comfortable disrupting life in poor and minority communities, and when you disrupt life, you find drugs, you make arrests, et cetera. We could be doing college campus police raids and finding people in possession of drugs all the time, but that would be unacceptable to the parents in the communities where these colleges exist. We do public raids into public housings, to poor neighborhoods, we stop and frisk people routinely. That's more acceptable, and that means that the numbers of people going to jails and prisons who are minorities grossly outweigh the numbers of people that has nothing to do with crime usage. The data is actually pretty compelling. Possession of marijuana, possession of narcotics, low-level narcotics, is a crime category where people of color do not offend more than people who are white. About 13% of the people in this country illegally in possession of drugs are African American. And yet 25% of the people who are arrested for drug possession are black. 55% of the people who are convicted for drug possession are black, and about 75% of the people who are sent to jail or prison are people of color. So at every level of this process, you see race shaping adverse outcomes, and that's the reason why you now have this tremendous increase in the number of people of color being sent to jails or prison. Without advocacy, without strong pushback, you're vulnerable to these really draconian sentences.
Advocacy and pushback takes money.
Advocacy and pushback takes money. We have a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And because of that, the poor and people of color are going to be vulnerable in ways that people who are affluent are not. The violent crime rate today is about where it was in the 1960s when the prison population was 300,000. That's not the reason why we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons.
You do have a distinction between sentencing for crack cocaine and other forms of cocaine.
That's right.
Adversely.
Oh, no question. I mean, it's the way we manage these crimes that creates these racial disparities. And so, for example, if we're going to give people convicted of crack cocaine possession a sentence 15 times greater than the sentence we give to people in possession of powder cocaine, you're going to adversely impact minority communities in ways that have nothing to do with public safety, but have everything to do with the narratives behind the crimes. You know, if we dealt with driving under the influence, which has a much greater cost to public safety than drug possession, and we enforced it in the same way we declared a war on drinking, then we would change the demographics of who's in prison. I think it's also true that in this country we have a history of racial inequality and racial justice that has left us compromised, left us vulnerable to presuming guilt and dangerousness when minority people interact with the criminal justice system. I think too many black men and boys are presumed dangerous and guilty when they're walking the streets. Police make that presumption, judges make that presumption, jurors make that presumption, and it creates these disparities that show up in our jail and prison population. I'm a middle-aged lawyer, been practicing law for 30 years, and even I get presumed dangerous and guilty sometimes. I was in a courtroom in the Midwest getting ready for a hearing one day, and I had my suit on and my shirt and my tie. I think it was maybe this suit, and sitting at counsel table, and the judge walked in, and he saw me sitting at defense counsel's table, and he looked up and he said, hey, You get out of here. I don't want any defendants sitting in my courtroom without their lawyers. You go back out there in the hallway and wait until your lawyer gets here. And I stood up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing and the prosecutor started laughing. I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And then the client came in, a young white kid who I was representing at this hearing. We did the hearings. But afterward, I was thinking to myself, what is it about that judge that he sees a middle-aged black man in a suit and a tie at defense counsel's table and it doesn't occur to him that's the lawyer? Do I think that that judge is going to treat minority defendants differently? I do. Do I think that's going to manifest itself in sentencing disparities based on race? I do. And that's not somebody who's consciously bigoted. That's not somebody who is proudly racist. That's just somebody who has inherited this narrative of racial difference that compromises us in all kinds of ways. In the criminal justice system, you see evidence of that in ways that are very, very problematic. We have people in this country who are born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They're chased by violent gangs. Their lives are shaped by violence. They're traumatized by violence. And at some point, they react violently to all of this stimulus. And that's when we arrest them. And if we say, oh, we can just be retributive toward that person, we're not really being very just. We're not really being very honest.
Or being effective.
We're not even being very effective because the truth of it is that retribution doesn't improve public safety. To say to a community, oh, after you've been raped, robbed, or murdered, we're going to really be tough on the offender isn't a very effective policy if your goal is to keep people safe. We have a death penalty in states like California is a really good example. California has over 700 people on death row. They spend $200 million a year on maintaining the death penalty. In the next 5 years, they'll spend $1 billion on the death penalty. And you know what? Nobody's going to be executed in California, in all likelihood, in the next 5 years. And yet, at the same time, about 34% of all murders in California don't get solved. And the police will tell you that they can't solve the murders because they don't have the resources to investigate these crimes. About 46% of all rapes don't get solved. Same rationale, don't have the money. So you could argue, is it really effective to spend $1 billion on a retributive death penalty that's not really going to work while you don't have the resources to actually keep people safe? I think that's changing, I really do. I think that it's not just the number of people who have been, that's gone up when we talk about our prison situation, it's also the amount of money we spend. We spent $6 billion in 1980 on jails and prisons. Last year we spent $80 billion. And what that means is that states can't spend money on health and human services. They can't spend money on roads. They can't spend money on education. They can't spend money on public goods and services. And all of a sudden, you've got teachers and educators and elderly citizens worrying about their support and security, and a whole range of people now being implicated by this investment in mass incarceration. And I think that's changed the political environment. Now you see states that are looking to bring the prison population down because they can't afford to maintain these high levels of incarceration. I also think there's something really interesting in the political narratives that have emerged in the last decade or so. People from the right and the left have begun to question the legitimacy of a government that puts people in jail or prison for decades for simple possession of drugs, for low-level, nonviolent crimes. And I think that that environment is shifting enough that now it's not the kiss of death to say, you know what, the prison population should come down. It is both just and right and moral, but it's also smart. We cannot maintain our credibility, our legitimacy as a nation when we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We've got 6 million people on probation and parole in this country, 68 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job, they're going to be compromised, they're going to be disadvantaged. Each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. When we make a mistake, we want a little grace, we want a little room to be forgiven. And that's what everybody wants. I don't think any person should be reduced to their worst act. I think if you tell a lie, you're not just a liar. If you take something that doesn't belong to you, you're not just a thief. And I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. And that idea has to have resonance in a just society that's going to be both compassionate and just.